Welcome to my 2023 book review. And no, I didn't only read Sarah J. Maas books. I promise. All the other ones were rented from the library. This is just what I own. I did rate all these books on Goodreads, but it's only out of 5 stars there, and I want to do it out of 10 because I feel like it gives more more leeway. In my head, I like it better, so I'm gonna do it out of 10 stars. But I did rate it immediately after I read it on Goodreads. It may be different. Just to preface. Just as a disclaimer, I am going to include spoilers to some of the books because I have a bone to pick with some of the books, and some of them I really loved and I just want to talk about. So I will put timestamps that you can click on if you don't want any spoilers and you're wanting to read the book. I should probably preface that my goal in 2022 was to read 12 books, and last year I only read 5, and so I set the same goal for myself for 2023 and I ended up reading 16 books, so we have a lot more to unpack here. So last year in my 2022 book review, the last book I read was A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. I had only read the first one and I loved it and was obsessed with it, so naturally the first book I read this year was A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J. Maas. So originally I didn't know anything about this series. When I first picked it up, one of my friends just gave it to me and said that I had to read it. I know it's a popular opinion, but this is definitely one of the best books ever. It has that enemies to lovers trope. I think it's worth it when it takes 1,000 pages to get to a character's first kiss, which may seem excessive, but I mean, the first one, I feel like it was this kind of fantasy world where everything looks bright and pretty, and then all of a sudden you're taken into this dark fantasy, but in the best way possible. You kind of feel like you're in this fairy snow whimsical dreamland, and the change of events was nice compared to the first book. I thought we were gonna get stuck there, but it's not what ended up happening. Also in the series, the best characters I think were introduced in this book. In the first one, I mean, there are good characters, but there's 4 main new characters that are introduced in the new land that they're in. I mean, I wish I could read this book for the first time again. And if you're wanting to read the series, I would recommend don't look anything up online, because I did that at the end of the first one and I was like, and I'll put a spoiler right here, so click the little timestamp to skip ahead, but I was looking up Feyre and Tamlin fan fiction. I just wanted to see how other people interpreted them, and I could not find any fan fiction about them together except at the wedding when Rhysand was taking Feyre away. I was very confused. I was like, there's no way that people haven't drawn anything. And then I was like, who's this other guy? And I was like, that's Rhysand, right? Why? And then it was the slow burn. I don't really know how to explain this one without giving away the entire plot, and I also don't want to spoil the first one. So if you want that dark, lush kind of fantasy, I would highly recommend the series. I know it's really popular and everyone talks about it. I mean, obviously I would give this book a 10 out of 10. I gave the original A Court of Thorns and Roses, I think an 11 out of 10 or something. So I mean, this would have to be a 14 out of 10. Next we have A Court of Wings and Ruin. I just kept snowballing with these books. I know a lot of people like A Court of Mist and Fury the best, but I really enjoyed the political and war themes in this book. I think it's so interesting how the author created just an entirely new world with new lands, religion, politics, war. It's really mind-boggling. I think this one versus this one have very different themes. Obviously the romance was really good, but this one, it definitely had a lot of action. I think it's a common thing for everyone in the Maasverse or whatever it's called, that the last 100 to 200 pages of one of her books are just an absolute roller coaster, and I couldn't put it down at the end. Again, I would do anything to reread this book for the first time again. When my friend gave me the series, I really did not know what I was getting myself into, obviously. Spoiler, so skip ahead. Another thing I had accidentally Googled, I was trying to figure out something else, and then I saw one of the link pop-ups was who betrays Feyre, and I was like, ooh, and I clicked on it, which I shouldn't have, but it said Amren, and or Amren, I don't know, I think Amren, and I was like, oh my god, Amren betrays Feyre. And so the entire series I was waiting for her betrayal, and then it ended up not really being a betrayal. It was just to get her to the cauldron at the end, and then she ended up being the big hero. So the entire series I read Amren as, in my head, I was waiting for her to be evilly plotting against all the other characters, but the moral of the story was don't read spoilers. Okay, again, I don't know how to explain this without ruining the plots of the first 2 books, but just take my word for it. It's really good. I would have to give like a 12 out of 10. The writing's just so good, and it's such a good fantasy escape into another world. I know it's like the first fantasy series I've read since I was younger when I read Harry Potter, so I don't have a lot to compare to, but right now I love these books and the plot thickens. This was a really cute novella in between closing the 2 main characters chapter from the original trilogy into the next characters that are focused on, which is why I liked this book. But there was not really a plot, it was just good vibes, and you definitely get to see like the chosen family, and it's during winter. It feels like a warm hug, very cozy. I would give this book probably an 8 out of 10 just for the good vibes, but plot wise it wasn't like these. So I didn't immediately go to A Court of Silver Flames because I was so sad that that's the last one that's out right now, that I didn't want it to be over, and I wanted to try to be surprised as late as possible. So the next book I read was Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and this was actually adapted this past year into a series on Amazon Prime. I watched it after I read the book, and honestly I liked the series better. The thing about this book is it's set up like an interview. You only get like what the characters are individually saying in their interview, and that's the entire book. Okay, it's called an oral history format. I already read the same author's book, The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, and I loved that, and this was a lot different than that, and I think that's what kind of threw me off when I was first reading it. The book is about this girl, Daisy Jones. She joins a band, the Six, and you kind of just see the 2 main characters kind of like arguing between the whole book, and how there's like a lot of tension between them, and how that turns very toxic within the entire group. Without spoiling too much, I would give this book probably a 7 out of 10. It was still really entertaining, and I read it fairly fast, but again, I think the oral history format really threw me off, and that's why I didn't enjoy it as much as Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. I liked it a lot, but I didn't love it. The next 2 books I got from the library, so I don't have them, but I read 7 Days in June by Tia Williams, and the plot of this book is Ava, who is in her early 30s. She's a single mom and an erotica writer, and she has this past with another writer named Shane, and Ava and Shane have a history from when I think they were 17 years old, and all of a sudden at one of her events he just shows up. They obviously still have feelings for each other, and then you kind of see the tension between them. I didn't love this book. It was still really good, but when the characters were like 17, they only knew each other for a week. That's their backstory, and there's not like they do kind of have a little trauma together, but it's not much to be like over 15 years later. I don't know, I didn't quite understand how they still had so much feelings for each other, and they were like the only ones meant for each other, even though they only knew each other for a week. It was very Romeo and Juliet. I like a slow burn like this. I don't like really fast paced, all of a sudden like it's a week later and they're the one. Like in real life that doesn't work. I gave it 4 stars on Goodreads, but I think looking back, compared to the other books I ended up reading in 2023, I'd probably give it a 6.5 out of 10. It was still very entertaining to read. Ava, the main character, she's very witty, very funny, but the whole like reconnecting after like 15 years is kind of weird, and I think they should have had more of a backstory if they were to still have feelings for each other after 15 years. The next book I read, I had to read for summer reading for school, and it's called Biased: Uncovering the Hidden Prejudice That Shapes What We See, Think, and Do by Jennifer L. Eberhard. This book is about unconscious racial bias. She gives research, scientific, factual information about how racism is prevalent in America, especially today. I thought that this book was very well researched. I listened to part of it on audiobook, which was voiced by the author, which I thought was really cool. My favorite part of the book was probably when she's talking about real world examples, whether it was hers or other stories that she's encountered. You see how Dr. Eberhard goes from a young girl into her adulthood, and how being Black in America has shaped her profession and how she views the world. On Goodreads, I rated it 5 out of 5 stars. I think educationally, this was a phenomenal book. I would give it 9.5 stars. It's obviously a nonfiction book, so I can't really compare it to like wanting to get lost in the fantasy world. So the next book I read was I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy, her autobiography. I actually didn't read this. I listened to the entire audiobook when I was at work. All I did was fold clothes the entire day in receiving, so obviously I needed entertainment, so I listened to the entire audiobook in one go. This book was crazy. Jeanette talks about her acting career and how her mom kind of forced her into it, and how her mom influenced her eating disorders and her relationships with other people. The audiobook is voiced by her, and I think it just made it even more amazing. I'm really glad that I listened to it because I feel like in her voice you can really hear how deeply her mom affected her entire life, including now too. I think this book, it's obviously a memoir, you can't really compare it to like fiction books, but I would rate it a 10 out of 10. It was so interesting and it kept my attention for I think like the 6.5 hours long that the audiobook was. I mean, that's like a great feat to accomplish. I was entertained for that long. So after my 4-book hiatus, I finally picked A Court of Silver Flames Up by Sarah J Maas. I know a lot of people don't like Nesta, and she's one of the 2 main characters of this book. I feel like I got to like her a lot throughout this book, even though she is very stubborn, but I think ultimately that's something to admire about her. Cassian was the other point of view. Ubiquitously, everyone loves him. I love him. Everyone loves him. He's great. You see after the war from this book, it deeply affects Nesta, and how Cassian's kind of the only one who helps her become better mentally and physically. And listen, this book is thick. I would give this book a 9 out of 10. I really liked seeing different characters' point of views, but I did really miss Feyre's point of view. I can't wait for the next book. I really hope it's almost like a love square between Lucien, Elain, Azriel, and Gwen. I just feel like that would be so interesting. I've seen people say like it'd be interesting if Elain rejects the mating bond between her and Lucien. I don't like Elain and Azriel together. I feel like they have too much of the same energy, and I feel like Lucien would be that perfect match for Elain, and Gwen would be that perfect match for Azriel because they're kind of opposites. I think it would be almost interesting to get 4 different points of view, and I'd be okay with a 1,000-page book, okay? Listen, I'd be okay with that. For now, I'm so sad to set the series down and know that I don't have any new pages to read at the moment. It's very sad. I can't wait for the next one to come out, even though we will have to wait quite a while. The next book that I read was Milkfed by Melissa Broder, and honestly at the beginning of this book, the first about 15 pages was the main character Rachel, who suffers from extremely disordered eating, almost borderline, pretty much an extreme eating disorder. And I just talk about how like a day in her life and how much food consumes her thoughts and actions. It was honestly very intense at first, and I thought if the whole book was going to be about that I didn't want to read that because it was kind of too depressing. I mean, I like moments where you see characters suffer from something and then are enlightened by that, but the beginning of this book was very intense. I stuck through it, and I'm really glad that I did because I really enjoyed this book. The main character, Rachel, has a lot of issues. She has issues with her family. She doesn't really have any friends. She has a very poor relationship with her mother, and then she meets the other main character, Miriam, who is not shy around food, and simultaneously Miriam helps Rachel free herself of her disordered eating while Rachel helps Miriam understand her sexuality. Rachel, the main character, is very funny, which I think is why this book was very fast-paced and easy to read. Also, it had some moments that were like really intense. One of the quotes that I wrote down was, "I could never tell how other people saw me. Most of the time I felt like I was riding around in a car with a fogged window shield that made it difficult to decipher the perceptions of others. They were all just kind of pantomiming outside, grunting while I ran the wipers over and over. No matter how fast I wiped, I couldn't clear the fog." And I feel like this was interesting because the main character really struggles with relationships with others, and I think that this quote perfectly described how she is in the entire book. I would rate Milkfed 8 out of 10. I really enjoyed the character development, and I liked the ending. Even though it was pretty depressing, it really helped the main character move on to the next stage of life. The author has a few other books, and one of them is called The Pisces. That's me. I'm a Pisces. And just for the fact that I am a Pisces, I do want to read that book because I did enjoy this one a lot. So the next book I also had to read for school, so it kind of counts. It's called Well, What We Need to Talk About When We Talk About Health by Sandra Galea. This book kind of just goes right into healthcare and lifestyle and socioeconomic factors that influence disease, especially chronic diseases in America today. And this is a book that's kind of right up my alley. It's pretty much what I'm studying in school. This book is 304 pages, and I feel like it could have been condensed into like 25 pages because a lot of the factors could be kind of combined together. I saw a lot of other like Goodreads reviews agreed with that. If I'm comparing it to Biased, I really didn't like it as much. I'm gonna give it a 6 out of 10. Honestly, if I didn't have to read it for school, I probably would have just started skipping chapters until I found interesting ones, because they don't necessarily go chronologically. It had good themes, it just was very repetitive. The next book I read was The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, and I know this is another very popular book. Basically, the main character, Patroclus, he gets exiled from his home and he goes to live in another kingdom, who the son of the king is Achilles, and you see their relationship develop over years, and it's very sweet, it's very heartbreaking. One thing I kind of made the mistake of doing, which I would tell people not to do if you're gonna read this book, is there's like a character, what is it called, log? It describes all the characters in the back. Each description gives away pretty much like all the plots in the book, and I read them first because I was like, oh, this would be great, like I get to know the characters, and then it ended up being a lot of the plot of the book. So I wouldn't recommend reading that, like just at all. Just 86 it, just don't even read it. Especially the main character, Patroclus. Just don't even read his description, because if you don't know anything about the Iliad, it pretty much gives away the entire end, and I would have liked to be surprised by that. Nonetheless, I mean, this book was very beautifully written. I think compared to 7 Days in June, this was like a slow burn romance that was very enjoyable. I actually read this online the other day, and it said if you have to force characters to kiss in a book, that doesn't show that they're in love, and I feel like this book perfectly embodies that. I feel like 7 Days in June, that's like a lot of what it was about, and that's probably why I didn't like it, because you didn't actually get to see the relationship between the characters as deeply. But in this book, you saw a lot of how Achilles and Patroclus fell in love without it having to be so intensely physical. A note that I wrote down that kind of describes that: this morning he had leaped onto my bed and pressed his nose against mine. Good morning, he said. I remember the heat of him against my skin. And Patroclus said that about Achilles. I just thought this was a sweet moment, and they have a lot of sweet moments like this between them, and the relationship was just very wholesome. This book had me crying at 1 a.m. when I finished it, and the next day I felt like I was heartbroken. The ending is so tragic and sad. It's very Romeo and Juliet, except it's not quick, like a week. The characters knew each other for most of their lives. I would give this book a 10 out of 10. I really loved it. I wish it was one of those books that I wish I could read again for the first time. Next, during Halloween, I wanted like kind of a spooky book, so I read Carmilla by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, and I did read the version that had notes by Carmen Maria Machado, and I would definitely recommend reading that version because this book was published in 1872. I think it was just very helpful, and it was very clever. When I was reading the introduction by Carmen Maria Machado, I didn't realize as I was reading it, but I was trying to like Google some stuff about some of the people or the events that she was talking about, and all I could find online was other Reddit sources saying like this was very clever, but all those things were made up that she was talking about. That almost plays into the fiction of the book. Essentially, this book is about Laura, and she's very sad and lonely, and all she wishes is to have companionship and friends. She's kind of in this castle alone with her father in Austria, and one night there's a carriage crash outside the castle. Who she meets is Carmilla, because due to the crash she's too ill to carry on with the adventure, and her mom says that she'll be back for her. See the relationship between Laura and Carmilla grow. It's established right off the bat that Carmilla is a vampire. You see how Laura gets slowly drained of her energy, and how Laura is haunted by these terrifying nightmares and visions that she sees in her room at night. I feel like I learned a lot of new words from this book because the author likes to use the same words again and again. I would give this book an 8 out of 10. I liked how short it was. It felt like long and short at the same time, even though it's only 108 pages. If you want like a spooky vampire sapphic short novel, this is right up your alley. So the next book I read was Normal People by Sally Rooney. This is a very popular book. It seems like a lot of people either love it or hate it, and personally, I hated it. It was definitely my least favorite book that I have read this year. This book is about Marianne and Connell. At the beginning of the book, Connell's the really popular guy in high school, and Marianne kind of keeps to herself, and essentially they kind of switch roles as they go to college. It shows how they go in and out of each other's lives constantly, and how they're so bad at communicating and are just basically really toxic for each other. And maybe this is a spoiler kind of, but like I said, they come in and out of each other's lives, even though at the end it's kind of established that even if they have to like be separate from each other for a while, they still want to be with each other. They still have the worst communication, like even at the end of the book that isn't resolved, which just really made me mad. And I think as the book went on, I kept disliking the main characters even more and more. It just seemed like Marianne wanted to just marinate in her sadness for her whole life. The characters just could not communicate. Even there wasn't quotation marks throughout the whole book. There's just no quotation marks, and I think that obviously shows that they can't communicate with each other. I would give this book a 3 out of 10, maybe even a 2. I think people could either see this book as like really smart for how people can be toxic for each other, but they can't seem to get away from each other. But personally, I saw it as extremely annoying because it's like, there's so many other people, like go talk to other people. But I do have a quote from this book that I did like. Marianne says, "To feel that life was happening here in this place and not somewhere else far away." I think we see too much in social media and just the media in general of how other people are living like these great fantastical lives, and we imagine, oh, we could be doing something else, or maybe I shouldn't be here. But we have to realize that life is happening right now as we're experiencing it, and we have to appreciate what we have in the space and time that we exist right now. The next book I'm really excited to talk about because I remember last year I had said that I walked around a library and just picked out a random book, and that was like the worst mistake of my life because that book ended up being terrifying. I was going to meet my friend at a cafe and they ended up being 45 minutes late, and I was like, I don't know what to do with myself, but the public library was right there and I had my library card, so I just went and walked around and I found this book. It's called My Sister the Serial Killer by Oyunkan Braithwaite. I zoomed through this book. It was so good. The plot is the main character, Kareed, her sister Ayula is a serial killer. After the third boyfriend that her sister murders, she's like, maybe my sister's a serial killer. Throughout the book, Kareed's coworker Tade, she's like basically in love with this doctor that she works with, and all of a sudden her sister meets Tade and then they start dating, and she's really mad because she doesn't want her sister to kill the man that she really likes. And towards the end of the book, you see either Kareed has to save her sister or save Tade, and you see who she is as a character at the end and how she views relationships and which one she values more. And I don't know, I thought this book was just like, I could not put it down. I'm not kidding, I could not put this book down. Easily this book is a 10 out of 10. I loved it. The last 2 books of the year, I read these super quick in December. Throne of Glass by Sarah J Maas. After reading A Court of Thorns and Roses, I was really scared to read this because I didn't know if it could compare to it, but it definitely can. It's not like as intense romantically as A Court of Thorns and Roses is. A lot of people have a lot of opinions about which book should be read first, where the Assassin's Blade should be placed, but I decided to just read it in publication date order. I thought that would be the easiest. That's how it came out. That's how people originally had to read it. So I'm reading the Assassin's Blade right now. I just started it. Honestly, if I did it again, I might want to read Assassin's Blade first because it does kind of spoil some of the relationships in these 2 books about what happens to Selena, the main character, before she ends up where she is in this book. I guess you'll find out next year about my final opinion about where maybe it should be placed. Magic was taken away 10 years prior to this book taking place, and Selena, she is imprisoned in a salt mine, and the king is hosting a challenge to become the king's champion, and she is picked as one of the contestants to become the king's champion. Selena is an assassin. She has an amazing attitude. I love her. I love that she doesn't take anything from anyone. And also you see relationships develop between her and other characters. It shows really great friendships between her and 3 other characters. While Selena is fighting in the competition, all of a sudden her fellow competitors start getting brutally murdered, and so she has to figure out what's happening. I would give this book probably a 9 out of 10 on the Mossiverse scale. I think it definitely sets up this book really well, but it still has a really great story. Last but definitely not least, we have Crown of Midnight by Sarah J Maas. This one was amazing, definitely compared to this one. I loved this one. Again, it's hard to describe the book without giving plot details away, but if you want to skip ahead, I'll give the timestamp. Pretty much inevitably, Selena wins the competition and she becomes the King's champion. You definitely see the relationships between all the characters develop even more, and it had very like heartwarming and then heart-wrenching parts to it. On the Mossiverse scale, I would give it a 13 out of 10. I also think this is like my favorite cover out of all the covers. I think the pink is so pretty, and I love the like blue cast on her. This book gets very dark and intense, and there's a lot of action. I think it picks up a lot in this book, and the end of this book is just so heartbreaking, and it's so good, and it sets up for a new adventure. This is one of those books where I feel like I wish I could read for the first time again. It was very fast-paced, especially compared to Throne of Glass, but I loved it. And I know I cracked the spine for this one. I thought like I wanted all my books to look like super worn and like they had been loved and used, but I regret cracking the spine for Throne of Glass, because in their box set I think they look really pretty, and also these are, I don't know why, but these are super hard to crack. Like, I forcibly did this, which I regret. Love. Right now I'm reading The Assassin's Blade by Sarah J Maas, and I'm also reading The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins, because I read all the other Hunger Games and I wanted to read this one too. I'm about halfway through it right now. So that'll be in my book review for next year. My book goal for next year is 18 books. If I can just even reach 15, I would be happy. I feel like this year I really got back into reading like I used to when I was younger, and it's really fun. If you have any recommendations, please let me know for books that are similar to the themes or the genres that I read this year. I have like a really big reading list, but I'm always happy to add more. There's never enough books in the world for you to read, right? And if you've read any of these books, please let me know what you thought of them. I would love to have a discussion. That's all I have. Bye.